Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome back to Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. Whew, start of another week, and it's so hot here in Florida. It's just been triple digits for as long as I can remember, which, given how cooked my brain is lately, isn't a long time. Sometimes these dog days just feel like they go on forever, and I forget that it's not even proper summer yet. July is coming up, and it's only going to get hotter. So maybe I ought to get some more sunscreen or some aloe vera or something. Hot days always put me in a mood to remember times gone by, better times, worse times, maybe both. You know how it is. And that puts me in a mind to read an old story, something about a lost television show, or a series of lost television shows, I suppose. So, let's put on a tape for the class and delve into Memories by Mail by yours truly, Dr. Plague. I thought it was normal when I was a kid, but the more I think about it, the stranger it seems now. When I was a kid, we used to get cassette tapes in the mail for TV shows that never got produced. Years later, when I was an adult, I would become aware of the idea of a Nielsen house. For those of you who don't know, a Nielsen house is something that you're given as kind of a privilege. You usually get programs from the little box that they send to your home, and you send back reviews on what you watched. They monitor what you're watching as well, and most of the times you get paid for your efforts. You know, so they can see when you turn the channel and what you're watching more of. I had a friend in college that was part of the experiment, and when I tried to explain what we had been through, he said I must have been part of something different. We lived in a small house, high up on a mountain in northern Georgia. The house was basically a cabin, a loft room for the kids with a bed for my parents and a bathroom with a bathtub and a shower. The rest was just open space, and our living room was basically an old TV, a VCR, and a couple of bookshelves. The kitchen was on the other side of the house, directly under the loft where my sister and I slept, and I can remember waking up to the smells of breakfast cooking many, many times. We didn't have a Nielsen box. What we had was more like a Netflix service, except for cassette tapes. I was never really sure if it was a service that Mom had signed us up for or not. Dad worked in the lumber yard from sun up to sundown, and usually came home to eat and sleep. He would do this 6 days a week, taking Sunday off for church, and it was more like I lived in a single-parent household for most of my life. We got 7 TV channels, 8 if the weather was right, and the antenna was just so at just the right angle. But the videotapes were something we looked forward to. We didn't know where they came from, but they arrived on the 2nd week and the 4th week of every month. They always came in these little black boxes, and they never had any labels. There was always a little card tucked into the box, and when we were done watching the show, Mom would ask how we felt about it. Usually we would tell her basic things, whether we liked it or not, and whether it was interesting or not, but more than a few of these weird cassette tapes had shows on them that my sister and I talked about for a long time after they were over. We were talking about them last weekend, which is how the subject came up. My mom died pretty recently, and my sister and I met up for one last time at the cabin to reminisce and catch up on what had been going on. My sister lives 5 or 6 states away, so it isn't often that we get to see each other. We like to meet at the old cabin where we lived, have a beer or two, and do a little reminiscing. Neither of us are married, so it isn't like we have to involve kids or anything. Most of the time, we're just kind of comparing war stories from when we were kids and stuff. But this weekend, she brought up the old cassette tapes we used to get in the mail and asked if I remembered them. It took me a minute, but I found that I did. I remember Bobo's Circus and Castor's Creek, I said, scratching my chin as I tried to bring them up. Oh, God, and I remember Laughing Place. I still think of that sometimes. Do you think Mom kept those tapes? She asked, staring out into the night as she swirled her beer. I shrugged. I don't know. I know that there's no way she kept a copy of Laughing Place. We threw it out into the snow, remember? She gave me a look of such mischief that I worried what she might suggest. Want to go see if we can find him? I see that the VCR is still set up in the living room. I don't know. Do you think it's a good idea? Some of those tapes, but she cut me off. Maybe they're not as bad as we remember. Come on, it might be fun. I started to tell her no, but she'd made me curious. This was the first time I had thought about those tapes in about a decade, and I wondered if they were really as bad as I had made myself believe they were. Surely what I remembered was just something a child's mind had created. The tapes were probably no worse than anything I'd seen on HBO. I finished my beer and told her we'd go see if we could find them, and she clapped her hands and sprang up as we went to hunt for them. There's only two places that Mom would store things like that in the house. There was the attic, and there was the crawl space underneath the stairs. We went to the crawl space first, since it was right next to the living room. It was a dingy little space, without much in it besides a dozen cardboard boxes and some dust bunnies. I started to tell her that it was useless to look for it, and after the third box, I was ready to call it quits. But that's when we found the box full of old VHS tapes, and I guessed I'd been wrong. She looked into the box like a pirate finding buried treasure, and when she drugged them into the living room so we could go through them, I began to wonder what had brought all this on. As I recalled, she had been as freaked out by the tapes as I had been, and the idea that she wanted to go through them now was a little strange, to say the least. She dragged the box into the middle of the living room, and we started hunting through the piles of black cassette tapes. Most of them were things that we had recorded when we were kids. We hadn't been well off, but Mom had won a VCR at a church raffle when my sister and I were very young. It was one of our most prized possessions when we were kids, and I remember bugging my dad about getting us tapes so that we could record our favorite shows. He had indulged us a little, and we had quite a few homemade cassette tapes that we recorded from television. I saw old cartoons, some soap operas that Mom had recorded to watch later, and old fishing programs that Dad liked. Even a few of the labeled tapes that our parents and our relatives had gotten us for birthdays or Christmas. I was about ready to give up, wanting to tell her that we could just watch some old episodes of Pokemon or even some Thundercats tapes if she was feeling nostalgic. But then she came up with a tape that I recognized from the very bottom. It was in one of those off-white cases that they used to send it in, the ones that let you know that they were from whoever was sending these things to us. And she blew the dust off as she read the label on the underside of it. It was the tape we had received for Bobo's Circus. "Come on, let's see how well it aged," she said, as she went to the VCR. Bobo's Circus was one of the tapes that I remembered pretty well. It was about a clown named Bobo, who worked in a circus with several other clowns and a few other characters to round out the roster. There was Wingo, who I had always just thought of as the clown with green hair. There was Clarabelle, the pink-haired clown, and there was Chachi, the orange-haired clown. And then there was Bobo, who had red hair. There was a strong man, just called Strong Man, and a lion tamer named Rob. It reminded me a lot of Bozo the Clown, the show that had come on public access around the same time. The clown would have problems, and then they would solve them throughout the episode. But they weren't the usual problems you encountered on a show like this. That probably sounds a little weird, but you'll see what I mean. I didn't think the VHS would work, but as it came to life, I heard the trumpets blare, and the circus music started as the title card proclaimed it to be Bobo's Circus. The VHS had 5 episodes on it, and I remembered that we had told Mom we really liked the show when it came time to return the card with the information on it. Bobo's Circus, Episode 1, Bobo's Big Top Blues. Episode 1 was fairly normal. Bobo wanted to be a real circus clown, but he just couldn't get the tricks right. He would juggle things and then drop them on his head. He would try to do a cartwheel and then fall down. He would go to spray another clown with a seltzer bottle, but spray himself instead. Bobo was getting a little discouraged, but the other clowns wanted to help him. Wingo helped him with his cartwheel, Clarabelle helped him with his juggling, and Chachi helped him learn the things that a clown needed to learn if he was going to be on stage. By the end, Bobo was the star of the show, and he felt a lot better about himself and his act. All the clowns took a bow at the end of the episode, and the message seemed to be about not giving up when things got hard. It was a good message for kids, but it wasn't the only message that they learned at the circus. Bobo's Circus, Episode 2, Follow the Crowd. The episode starts with Bobo performing for a crowd. He's pulling long scarves out of his pants, and his underwear come out in the last one. Bobo is embarrassed because this isn't supposed to happen, but the crowd begins to laugh uproariously. They clap and cheer, and Bobo feels that he found a real winner. After the show, Clarabelle and Wingo comfort him as they tell him how embarrassed he must feel. But Bobo is ecstatic. He says he's going to integrate it into his act in every show, but they say he shouldn't do things just because he got a big laugh. Bobo didn't listen, and he does the act the same way every time. You would think that the message would be not following the crowd because eventually they would get tired of this one, but the crowd loved it. No matter how many times Bobo does the trick, they always laugh and clap. Towards the end of the episode, Bobo just stands there and soaks in the applause as the audience claps and claps and claps. When I was a kid, this made me feel kind of weird. It felt strange to just stand there, accept their applause as they clapped. Why didn't he move? It also felt like he was staring straight into the camera as they clapped. And I always felt like he was looking at me. Underneath the grease paint, you could see how bloodshot his eyes were, and he looked crazed as the applause went on and on. The episode was the same length as the others, but it seemed to go on and on for a really long time. The episode finally ended with Bobo continuing to stare at the camera as the credits rolled. I looked at my sister when the episode was over, but if she was put off by this, you couldn't tell. Bobo's Circus, Episode 3, Liquid Courage. The episode starts with Bobo performing on stage again. He's doing wonderfully, really hitting his stride, but then he gets nervous and drops his clubs while he's juggling. The audience begins to boo, and as Bobo tries the trick again, he gets nervous and drops the clubs all over again. The audience continues to boo, and Bobo finally leaves the stage as he shakes his head and runs away. He looks really sad, and I remembered when I was a kid I wanted to comfort him because of how distraught he looked. I remember flubbing my lines during a play when I was younger, and how the audience had whispered and made me feel nervous. I felt like I knew what Bobo was going through. The other clowns try to comfort him and boost his confidence, but Bobo says he's not sure he wants to go back on stage. Then a new clown comes out, and it's the only time I remember seeing him in the whole show. He says his name is Pluto, and he constantly stumbles around and drinks from a bottle with a long neck. He offers some to Bobo, telling him it's liquid courage, and that it'll make him a star. Bobo, not knowing any better, takes the bottle and has a long sip. In typical fashion of a little kid's show, he begins to sway and hiccup almost immediately. Then, They show the two of them laughing and pounding each other on the back as they drink from the bottle. It cuts a little and we see Bobo being announced as the next performer. He stumbles on the stage with his clubs, but every time he tries to juggle, he drops them and they come down on his head with a crash. The audience doesn't boo this time, though. They applaud and laugh at Bobo as he makes a fool of himself. Even as a kid, I knew that wasn't okay, that they were laughing at him instead of with him. Bobo continues to clown around for a little while, and when he gets done, he takes a big bow and stumbles off stage. The other clowns, because Pluto is nowhere to be seen by now, talk to him about how he didn't perform, but he was just being a fool. They tell him that those people weren't laughing at his act, they were laughing at him. They tell him that if he continues to drink, he won't be a star, he'll just be a fool. The episode ends with Bobo swearing that he'll never drink again, and all the clowns gather around him to give him a big hug. The message of the show seems to be one that was against alcohol, but it was hard to figure out as a kid. They never came right out and said that they were against drinking, which was pretty common in those days. Usually there would be a segment at the end where they'd tell kids not to drink or not to do drugs or something like that, but this one just showed Bobo acting like a fool and then deciding never to do it again. I began to wonder who had made these shows and why they just sent them to our house. Surely this wasn't how they had marketed them, but one look at my sister showed that she was absolutely glued to the set as the next episode started. Bobo's Circus, Episode 4, Sharpshooter. The circus has a new act. The ringmaster, another new character, introduces a sharpshooter named Wyatt. Wyatt is going to work for the circus as he made a name for himself, and all the actors welcome him warmly. This was the first time we get to see the strongman and the lion tamer, and as they all went off to do whatever they were going to do, that just left Bobo and Wyatt on the stage to talk. Bobo told Wyatt that his gun was cool and asked if he could see it. He wants to play with the gun, thinking it's a toy, but Wyatt told him he was never to touch it. He said it was a tool and that it was important and that Bobo couldn't just go around playing with it like it was any old thing. A little later, Bobo finds Wyatt's gun in a holster and he decides to play with it, even though he was told not to. Bobo pretends to shoot at make-believe targets, making a pew-pew sound as he does. Wingo comes around the corner, startling Bobo, and when he turns with the gun in his hand, it accidentally goes off. Wingo clutches his arm and yells as he falls down, crying and holding on to his wound. Even as a little kid, I remember thinking the acting was really good in this episode. When Wingo got shot, I remember thinking the blood looked pretty real for what amounted to a kid's TV show. I couldn't honestly believe it was real. It was something on TV, which I knew meant that it was probably fake. Wingo rolled around for a while as Bobo apologized, and as the others came in to see what all the noise was about, they found Bobo holding the gun and scolded him for being irresponsible. The whole time, Wingo is still acting like he's been shot, and I could see him begging the others to help him as he clutched his arm. It seemed very real, even now, when it cut to a little bit later, as Wingo had his arm in a bandage and a sling. We got a finale where Bobo promises that he had learned his lesson and he would never play with guns ever again. Looking at it now, I could see the look on Wingo's face, and it looked like he was still in pain. Surely they hadn't really shot someone just for an episode of this show. That would have been insane. They all waved as the episode ended, and as the next one started, I thought I remembered how the show had ended. I remembered, and I really didn't want to see it. Sis, let's take a break. I don't think I want to watch the rest of this. If she heard me, she gave no indication. She just kept watching as the last episode on the tape played out. I wanted to get up and leave, but I kept my seat. It was just a kid's show after all. It was possible that I had remembered it wrong after all these years. Bobo Circus, Episode 5. Tragedy. The circus had another new act. This time it was a group of acrobats who walked on a trapeze. There were 5 of them, and they all smiled and waved and introduced themselves as the Flying Benzinis. There was a mother, a father, 2 brothers, and a daughter, and they were all in colorful costumes. Bobo wasn't going to perform that night because the acrobats were going to be the main event. He was upset about that, but the ringmaster assured him that he would have his time next time. He told him to go check the trapeze and make sure that everything was in order. Bobo complained as he went to go do this, saying that it wasn't fair that they got to be the main event tonight. He didn't do a very good job of checking the stage or the trapeze, and as the family was introduced, they got up to prepare to go on and begin their routine. As Bobo watched, the trapeze began to become undone, and they all fell off screen. The fall didn't look so bad, but it was the screams that the audience gave out that were the worst. They were shrieking like someone had died, and when everyone came back on stage, it was once again to tell Bobo how he had been wronged. They told him that the performers had died because he hadn't done his job. Bobo said he was sorry, but they said that wasn't good enough. They said that he'd have to be punished, and then several of them came up to hit the poor clown with belts. The noise he made while they were hitting him was worse than the noise the audience had made. He screamed as they beat him, their belts lashing him as he curled up and took it. The strong man, the ringmaster, even some of the clowns rained down blows on Bobo, and when they were done, he just lay there for a minute as they told the audience how it was always important to do your job and do it right. People could get hurt if you didn't, and then there would need to be a punishment if they got hurt because of your negligence. The episode ended with everyone smiling and waving, except for Bobo. He just lay there and twitched as the credits rolled, and I was shaking as the episode ended. Why the hell did Mom let us watch this? My sister shrugged. Who knows? It only lasted until she caught us watching Laughing Place. Remember? That's when she told us that we couldn't watch these anymore. I shuddered. I think she would have told us to stop watching them before that, if she had seen that last episode of Bobo's Circus. I wonder if there's any more of them. I don't know if I want to see any more of them, I told her flatly. Why do you want to see them so badly? I can remember a time when you had nightmares about these things constantly. Why do you want these VHS tapes? My sister sighed, staring into the static on the TV screen, and she seemed to contemplate how to answer me. Because I'm in trouble, big brother, and I'm hoping these tapes can help get me out. What do you mean? I asked, not understanding. She sat there for a little while, as the TV static cast ghostly images across her face. You know I got divorced last year, right? I nodded. Derek got the kids and the house. You got half his retirement and the money you'd put into your joint account. She nodded. The thing is, nobody knows why I got divorced. I have a gambling problem. I have ever since college, and it's only gotten worse. Derek found out about it, and it was hard not to find out about it after I borrowed money from people who came looking for it. He said he couldn't keep the kids in a place that wasn't safe. He divorced me for the kids' safety, but that didn't make the debt go away. I need cash, and I've been talking to some people online about tapes like the ones we watched when we were kids. Apparently, there's a big market for these tapes, and if I can get my hands on them, then they might be worth enough money to get me out of debt. I looked at her in disbelief. My sister and I had always been close. We had been the only real support system for each other for a while, and I couldn't believe that she hadn't told me about this. We had never kept anything like this from each other, and knowing that she was in deep trouble and hadn't even told me made me feel terrible. You say these tapes are worth money, but how much money can some old VHS tape be worth? There's only about 5 episodes of Bobo's Circus. Of those 5 episodes, there are only 5 known copies of them in existence. There are other kids like us who used to get strange cassette tapes for unaired shows, and copies of them are ridiculously expensive. The VHS tape we just watched is supposed to be worth about $5,000 in raw form. I was speechless. Couldn't believe what I was hearing. What kind of people would pay for something like that? Of course, I knew there were people out there that would pay for nearly anything, but I guess I never thought that something like this was actually worth money. I asked someone on the forums what both Bobo's Circus and Castor's Creek would be worth, and he told me that if they were in working order, they could be worth about $15,000. If I had the originals, that is. That's enough money to make a dent in my debt, and I really want to make a dent in that debt. The people I owe money to are starting to get very vocal about having it back, and it's only a matter of time before my IOUs are no good. If you help me, I'll give you some of that money if that's what you want, but I need enough to get out of debt. I shook my head. It's not about the money, sis. If it helps you get out of danger, then of course I'll help. I just wish you had told me about this. I would have helped you. You know that. She started crying, nodding her head as she apologized. Thank you. Thank you so much. We started looking for the other tapes almost immediately. I told you about 2 of them, but there were a few others as well. There was Castor's Creek, which was kind of a show for teenagers more than kids, and there was Bobo's Circus, which I already told you about. There were a few others that were unremarkable, just PBS-style shows that wouldn't have made much of a stir anywhere. There were 4 others that stood out, besides the ones I've mentioned, though, and those were Holly's Hobbies, the Roto Robots, Miss Ashley's Swing, and Laughing Place. They were kids' shows, live action or animated, but they all had this weird sort of otherworldly feel to them that seemed strange when you're a kid. Some of them were live action, so they must be real, but they're also clearly produced, so they can't be real. I don't know how to explain it better than that, but it was always a little confusing for a kid when you find something like that. We searched the crawl space again and found another box of old VHS tapes. This one was full of tapes I had never seen before, things I had overlooked when I was a kid. Our parents' wedding was in there, as well as the VHS tapes from Christmas mornings and our birthday videos. Things that adults save, but kids usually roll their eyes at. We dug through the box like there might be gold at the bottom of it. And I guess there was, sort of. We were hoping that there was some of those videos in the white cases in there, but no luck. Any ideas? She finally asked. I seem to remember keeping Roto Robots in my room at one point. I might still have it in there. We headed up the stairs to look, both of us hoping that it would pan out. Our rooms were much the same way they had been when we were kids. Mom hadn't had the heart to change anything after we'd moved out. The same posters were on the wall, the same furniture was in the room, and even some of the same stains were on the ceiling and on the windows. They were like time capsules, but we were searching for something a little different than the usual time capsule stuff. We were looking for genuine treasures amongst the old G.I. Joes and the old candy wrappers that I had left behind. I checked the usual places I would hide things that I valued. I looked in the other crawl space in the side of my closet, but it wasn't there. I checked the loose floorboard beside my bed, where I usually hid old baseball cards and Halloween candy, but nothing by way of VHS tapes was in there. I checked the closet, under the bed, and even in the drawers where I kept my clothes, and that was when it occurred to me. I looked at the old VHS player in my room and wondered why I hadn't thought of that first. The chances of it being in there were slim, but it turned out that slim odds were exactly what we were after. I peeked in the slot of the old TV VHS player that I had bought when I was in high school, and sure enough, there was something in there. I hit eject, and out came another one of those unassuming looking VHS tapes. The nameplate on the side read Roto Robots, and I thought my sister was going to start crying all over again. We took it downstairs to the big TV, and as we slid it in, I found myself crossing my fingers that it still worked. To our joy, the title came up and told us that it was a test screening for the show Roto Robots. Roto Robots was somewhere between GoBots and Transformers. It was clearly made for a younger audience in mind, but the episodes had gotten a little mature the longer we watched them. The show followed 5 robots who fought against Robo Sapien and his Snaketrons. It was a pretty common formula at this point in time, but the show had appealed to me, even when I was an older teenager. I couldn't have told you why, but I really liked the story, which probably explained why it was in my VHS player. Roto Robots, Episode 1, Roll Out. The first episode was a pretty standard introductory episode. It introduced the robots, it introduced the bad guy, and it let you know what to expect from the show going forward. Robo Sapien and his Snaketrons stole some technology from the lab where the robots were created, so they went out to get it back and thwart him. There were 5 robots: the blue one, named Robbie, who was their leader; the red one, who was named Rusty and acted as their mechanic character who worked with machines; the green one, who was named Speedy and who was fast; the pink one, named Vicky, who was mostly just there to be fought over by the boy robots; and Reggie, who was gray and seemed to be their muscle. The first episode just showed them fighting bad guys and coming back victorious as they delivered their catchphrase of "Robots, roll out." Like I said, the show wasn't exactly an exercise in brain power. The formula was pretty consistent, with a dozen other robot shows at the time, but it sort of went off the rails after that point. Roto Robots, Episode 2, One Team. This was a pretty standard formula for a lot of cartoons at the time period. I remembered seeing a similar plot on Ninja Turtles, Thundercats, and Ghostbusters. It was the basic argument about who was going to be the leader. Robbie was the de facto leader, but Rusty thought that he would make a better leader than Robbie. Speedy thought that he would make a better leader, and Reggie also thought that he should be the leader. Vicky did little else besides swoon over them and tell them how awesome they were and that each of them would make a great leader. Looking back on it, it was kind of terrible how female characters got treated in some of those earlier 80s cartoon shows. So of course, the only way to solve the matter was to have a contest. Each of them would compete in a series of events to see who was the best. Speedy won the race as the fastest. Reggie won the contest to be the strongest. Rusty was the smartest, and Robbie was the best at figuring things out. The last competition was a scenario, like what they might find in the field, and Robbie won that one because he directed the team the best. Robbie had more points by the end, so he got to be the leader, even though the rest of them grumbled about it. The episode ended with Vicky giving him a big kiss on the cheek and proclaiming him to be their leader forever. Roto Robots, Episode 3, Snake Song. Episode 3 was when things started to get kind of weird. The story was about the snake sapiens and how they were trying to upload a computer virus that would destroy the roto-robots. At the base, Rusty was trying to program a way to stop the virus. But the rest of them were just kind of waiting to see what shook out. The strange thing was that Vicky was acting way more inappropriate than usual. Before then, it had been little things, being flirty or being a bit goo-goo-eyed over Robbie, but now she was clearly acting in an adult way to the other robots. She would touch them and talk to them in ways that I guess I had missed when I was a kid, but it was no wonder the show hadn't been produced on anything other than these cassette tapes. The strangest thing was the way her voice actress sounded during these moments. She sounded hesitant, uncomfortable, and a few times I thought I could hear someone coaching her as she hesitated to say the things they wanted her to say. Whatever the case, she didn't appear to be on board with what was happening, and it escalated as the episode went on. Rusty discovered that Vicky had the virus that the snake sapiens were making, and that was why she was acting so strangely. They quarantined her until they could find a cure, and that was how the episode ended. Roto-Robots, Episode 4, Plague. After that, the bad guys were never seen again. I don't know what happened to them, but Vicky sort of became the antagonist after that. She would talk to whatever robot brought her food or things she needed, and the way she talked to them made my skin crawl. The 4 male robots still went out to do things, and in the episode, they put out a fire and rescued a family from a flood. But it was the times they interacted with Vicky that stood out to me. She would try to seduce them, and it just made me uncomfortable to hear her talk like that. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, and the longer it went on, the less I liked it. How had I forgotten all of this? It was like I'd completely blocked all this out in place of the action scenes, and I remembered really liking this stuff when I was a kid. Maybe I had overlooked it because of my age, but it was pretty clear that Vicky was going down a dark path the longer it went on. The episode ended with her begging Robbie to let her out, and Robbie crying oily tears as he told her that they couldn't until they knew what was wrong with her. Roto-Robots, Episode 5, Spread. Episode 5 was easily the worst of them all. It started with Robbie coming to bring Vicky her dinner. I remember it vividly from when I was a kid, even though I'm not sure how I could have. I remember Robbie walking down this long hallway, the hallway dark and kind of creepy. As he came down the hall, you could hear Vicky calling to him and begging for him to let her out. And just let her out. Robbie was trying to ignore her, but it was pretty clear that he was losing the fight. When he came up to the door, he dropped the food hatch, and you could see her peeking at him through the little slot. She told him to come inside so they could talk about it, but Robbie told her that she was sick and that she wasn't allowed to have any company. She told him to just come in for a little while, and that she just wanted to see her friends. Robbie looked torn, like he didn't know what to do, and finally, he told her that he couldn't come in and that she shouldn't ask him to do such things. Then, as he went to put the tray on the flap, Vicky had grabbed him by the arms, and even as an adult, the sequence was pretty scary. We hadn't seen Vicky up until that point. We'd only heard her talk through the door. Her hands were covered in rusty spots that looked a lot like blood, and when she grabbed him by the arms, the spots began to transfer to him as well. He was suddenly covered in these red blemishes that traveled up his arms and onto his torso, and before long, he looked like he'd been staying in a junkyard for years and years. He let her out after the spots took him over, and the two of them spent the rest of the episode moving through their base and passing it on to the others. They got Rusty, they got Reggie, and finally they even caught Speedy. The episode ended with all of them laughing maniacally. They spent a long time just laughing and looking at the audience. And when the episode finally ended, the credits were completely silent. We sat there for a minute and just watched the blank TV screen as the VHS tape rewound itself. Suddenly, I was remembering a lot more about these tapes, and I started wondering again who was sending them to us. Why were they sending a mother and her child these strange VHS tapes of cartoon shows that were never made? What was the point? My sister took the tape out and slid it into the case. She looked as if she had found the Holy Grail, and maybe she had. These tapes were so different than I remembered them, but maybe they weren't different in the way that she remembered them. Maybe she remembered them this way the whole time, and that's why they were so valuable. They were full of these strange anomalies and bits of human suffering that I was very aware that people online would pay big money for. I tried to tell myself that it was just something she was doing to get herself out of trouble, but the more of these we watched, the harder it got to tell myself that. "Where should we look next?" she asked. But I thought I had a pretty good idea of our next destination. I remember that Mom put a bunch of our stuff in the attic. Maybe we should go there next. The two of us stood at the bottom of the hole downstairs that would take us to the attic, daring the other to go up and look for the box. The attic was always somewhere we had avoided when we were kids. Nobody really wanted to go up there, and Mom seemed to be the only one who would venture up there when we needed to find something. It was a pretty big attic, considering that it was the size of the entire house. It hung above the loft that my sister and I had slept in, and sometimes late at night you could hear things up there. I always thought it might be rats or raccoons, but the longer I lay in bed and listened to them skitter up there, the less I believed it. You could only sit up here for so long and listen to them scratch around before you began hearing monsters or demons, and you knew they were waiting for you to fall asleep so they could get you. I had avoided going up in the attic unless it was absolutely necessary, but in this case it seemed like it might be. Mom had stored a lot of our old stuff up there, and if we were going to find more VHS tapes, then it would probably be there. "Come on," my sister said, as she gave me a little push. "Don't be a baby. That's rich coming from you. I don't see you in any hurry to go up into the attic either." "Well, we'll never know what's up there unless we go," she pointed out. "I guess we'll have to go together," I said, as I headed up the stairs and into the dark space. The attic was exactly the way I remembered it. It was dark, the light from my phone barely illuminating the surface. It was musty as well, not much light coming in to knock away the cobwebs or the dust bunnies that had taken over the place. I doubted that anyone had been up here since Mom died, and it was all just kind of all over the place. There were mounds and mounds of boxes, all of it sitting helter-skelter around the area. Mom probably hadn't done a lot of organizing up here, so it was just all piled around with very little thought given to placement or organization. My sister and I spread out, wanting to cover more ground, and it didn't take me long to find a box full of videos. They weren't hard to find. One of the cases gleamed at me from the top, and I could already see several old cartoons sitting inside, just waiting to be discovered. "Found some more," my sister called, and I grabbed up my own box and headed for the stairs. What a coincidence I seemed to have, but then something screamed and burst out of the box. I nearly dropped it. Something screamed like a banshee and leapt at me, causing me to bat it away as the box wobbled in my hand. I was panicking as I started to turn, but When I saw what it was, I laughed at my own silliness. The rat had probably been living in that box for a long time, and he really didn't seem to appreciate us messing with his house. He hissed at me as he ran away, streaking deeper into the attic before disappearing completely. "Are you okay?" my sister asked, coming over after hearing the loud noise. "I guess," I said, "but I guess we gotta call an exterminator and get rid of these rats." She laughed and held up another box gingerly, as though afraid more rats might be ready to come out. "You can pay for the exterminator out of your part. I think mine might be a little bit preoccupied." We took the boxes downstairs, and luckily, they didn't have any more rats in them. Some of the cartoons had been a little chewed, but most of them were in good shape. I was surprised that none of them had fallen victim to the usual problems of storage. I didn't hear any mouse poop rattling around in them, and I didn't see any spools that looked chewed on. Just normal dirty cassette tapes, sitting in a box and waiting to be discovered. We dug through more recorded cartoons, old VHS tapes, and plenty of other stuff that I had never seen before. It was weird to not recognize some of the boxes that I'd seen all my life, but I guess that's what happens when you go away for a little while. As we sorted through, we finally came across what we were looking for. We found Holly's Hobbies in my box, and Castor's Creek in hers. Castor's Creek was another show that I remembered pretty fondly. My sister hadn't really been interested in it since it was more for older kids, but I'd watched quite a few episodes, and I liked it a lot. I was old enough to understand the relationships and the other things that had happened during the episodes, and it had made me feel like an adult to watch the show. I wondered if it would be like Roto Robots as I looked at the case, full of things I didn't remember and couldn't explain. I hoped it wouldn't, because I had a lot of fond memories where this show was concerned. "Which should we watch first?" she asked. "Let's watch Holly's Hobbies first. I don't remember a lot about that one, and it might be nice to see it again." Holly's Hobbies was a kids' craft show that had an element of storytelling within it. Holly was the main character, and seemed to be the only character on the show at all. Usually shows like that had puppets or other people, but the show had Holly moving between these bland sets with colorfully lit panels in the background as she worked on the day's craft. The only other thing in the scenes were these gray card tables with craft supplies standing on them. It was a little weird, and even as a kid, I thought the sets and the setup were kind of strange. As the tape went in and the static began to diminish, I remembered something about the show. My sister had liked it, but it had always made me feel kind of scared and anxious when I watched it. I couldn't have said why, but I knew what the feelings were. As the theme song started and I saw Holly come bouncing onto the set, I was suddenly reminded why. Holly's Hobbies, Episode 1, Mom's Birthday. The first episode was pretty bland as far as pilots go. Holly came out onto the set and introduced herself, and waved at all the boys and girls out there in TV land. The sound of something hitting the floor was just out of camera, and Holly said it was time to check the mail. She went to another colorful backdrop and bent down as she picked up an envelope. It was from Holly's mother, and she was reminding Holly that they were going to have a birthday party later that day. Holly acted surprised. She couldn't believe that she had forgotten it was her mother's birthday, and told the boys and girls that they needed to make her a present. What followed were 3 different crafts. One was a birthday card, one was paper flowers, and one was a colorful envelope to put the card in. She ended the episode by waving goodbye and heading out to her mother's party. As a kid, I had thought it was nice that she had made a card, but as an adult, it wasn't the craft that I was paying attention to. Holly, the hostess, was trying her best to keep a smile on her face and keep her energy up, but it was strange how she would glance offset sometimes, or seem to forget her lines before looking over there. and then just picking them up again. Sometimes she looked afraid, and she would rub her arms, which was always covered by a sweater. To a kid, these would just seem quirky, but to me they seemed like Holly was afraid of someone who only she could see. Even her exit felt like she was glad to be gone and hoped that she wouldn't be asked to come back. Holly's Hobbies, Episode 2, Fall. Holly is still inside, but she bounds around as she talks about how she loves fall. She says the leaves change, and it gets colder, and you get to wear comfy sweaters. We cut to a different area and see a pile of leaves, which Holly jumps into with a little whoop that turns into a yelp of pain. She stands up, rubbing her back, but makes herself smile through the pain. She says it's great that these leaves are here since they can use them to make a craft. She bends down and picks some of them up before taking them to the next area. Here, they draw trees and stick the leaves to them so that they can make them look like fall trees. I had to rewind it twice, something my little sister did not seem to like, but as she made the tree, you could hear someone talking to her, just offset. It was hard to make out. They were talking pretty low, but it sounded like they were threatening Holly, and you could hear her make an odd sobbing sound a few times before it panned up to her smiling and holding up her picture. She then made a jack-o'-lantern with a pumpkin that was sitting on the other table. At one point, as she's carving the mouth, the knife slips and you can see her cut her hand. The camera doesn't stop, but Holly puts her hand to her mouth and hisses in pain. She looks at the camera and seems to beg whoever is filming to stop, but they must be telling her to go on because she continues to carve the pumpkin, despite the blood smearing it. She smiles at the finished product, her blood having been hastily wiped away from the jack-o'-lantern, but the smile is rigid as she explains that jack-o'-lanterns are part of Halloween. The last craft is a tissue paper ghost, and it's hard not to notice the blood that gets on this as well. Someone appears to have given her a napkin to press against the wound, but the cut is pretty obviously hurting her. She tells us that she hopes we have a wonderful fall and says goodbye as she holds up the paper pumpkin in her wounded hand and waves. I didn't remember this episode from when I was a kid, but I remembered being afraid to carve a jack-o'-lantern a couple of times when it was Halloween. I have to believe that this episode of Holly's Hobbies was the reason. Holly's Hobbies, Episode 3, Christmas. This episode was a pretty typical Christmas episode, but it definitely raised some red flags. Holly appears in a Santa outfit, but it's a little skimpy for a kids' show. She wasn't indecent, but it did allow us to see some of the bruises that were on her arms and her shoulders. The bruises were clearly finger marks, but Holly was all smiles and jolly attitude as she wished everyone a Merry Christmas and hoped that Santa brought them lots of toys. That episode's craft was a tree made out of toilet paper rolls, a snowman made out of cotton balls and felt, and candy canes made out of paper and colored with crayons. Holly didn't seem as nervous in this episode, and you can hear someone whispering to her again from off camera. I heard a couple of times what they were saying, and it was never anything good. At one point, they called her a stupid whore and a damn junkie, but she just kept smiling through the whole thing and making her craft. As the episode ended, she sang Up on the Housetop as the credits rolled, and you can hear the voice rising in anger before the episode cuts off. I started to ask, but my sister shushed me as the fourth and final episode started. Holly's Hobbies, Episode 4, Mourning. This was the fourth episode, and it was definitely the most uncomfortable. The show began with Holly holding a letter and sobbing openly. It wasn't fake crying either. She was really letting them fall. And she cried and cried for nearly 5 minutes as the camera rolled. When she looked up at the camera, It was in disbelief. She kept looking around in disbelief, as if she couldn't believe whoever was filming this was going to make her do this, but when the camera showed no sign of stopping, she finally wiped her face and told the kids in TV land that her mother had passed away. Holly couldn't believe it. She had just been at her mother's birthday party, but she supposed that everyone has to die sometimes. It made me sad as a kid, but it really hit me hard as I sat there in my childhood living room and watched this woman have a mental breakdown as the camera rolled. We'd lost our own mother, after all, and I could understand what she was going through. Holly went about her crafts listlessly, glancing off camera to see if she would be given a reprieve. It never came. She was forced to make a remembrance book for her mother. The book took longer than most of the crafts usually did, because Holly had to stop and cry quite a lot. She assembled pictures of a woman who looked a lot like her into the pages of a picture album, and when she closed it, there was quite a bit more crying before she got up from the table and went to the next area. Next, she made a bouquet of flowers that she was going to leave for her mother. But there was something else going on off camera. Sometimes her hand would put flowers down so that she could work on something else, and I hadn't been able to see it until just before she picked up the flowers. She was winding pieces of rope together, and I didn't want to know what her plans were for those or what she was making. Instead of a third craft, she shuffled into frame of a third area and just stood there as she faced the wall. She had the flowers in one hand, but in the other, she had a length of rope, as if contemplating what she meant to do with it. There was shouting off camera as the paper flowers she had made hit the ground, and it cut off abruptly as the credits rolled over a dark screen. I hadn't liked the episode as a kid. It made me realize that my own mother would one day die, but neither of us had been able to say that any of the episodes were bad. They'd made me feel bad, but none of them had been poorly put together or been unentertaining to watch. As the snow came down on the television screen, I looked at my sister and saw her reach for the next tape. I put a hand over hers, stopping her. She turned to look at me, and her smile was so wide that I thought she might bite me. "Why do you want to watch these?" I asked, voicing the question I should have from the start. For a moment, all she did was smile in the face of my confusion. "Why do you want to see these old tapes so badly?" My sister said nothing, just continued to look at the screen as the snow pattered behind the glass. "You said that their value is in just owning them, so why do you need to watch them?" It was a question I should have asked before now, but I seemed to be afraid of the answer. Truth be told, I wasn't really sure I wanted to know. My mind needed to know, though, so I had asked. I don't think she was going to answer me for a minute. I thought she was just going to pop in the next tape and continue her marathon, but what she said really stuck with me. It's stuck with me ever since that night. I feel the same way about them that you do, but the apprehension and disgust I feel are nostalgic. I didn't understand these stories when I was a kid. How could I? We were poor, but you and I grew up free of strife or any of the abuse that some of the people in these shows seem to have experienced. In a way, I suppose we were lucky. In a way, though, it didn't really prepare me for what was to come. My life has been so much less stable than it was when I was a child, and I think I resent now that we didn't have a little bit of upheaval when we were kids. It might have made me capable of handling what I'm going through now. These tapes, though, they They make me feel the way I did when I was a little girl. They take me back to a time before all these terrible things happened, and they remind me that there were better times and easier ways when the only apprehension was felt as we watched these tapes. It was the saddest thing I'd ever heard, and I didn't really know how to take it. Thinking about it, I knew she was right. We had never really had any reason to feel slighted or put upon when we were kids. We lived very comfortably, if not poorly. We never wanted for food or shelter. We were happy with just a few VHS tapes and a TV to watch them on. And I nodded as she took the next tape out of the box and set it up. It was Castor's Creek, a story I was very familiar with since it had been one of my favorites. Castor's Creek was about 5 Maine kids who lived in a small town and had small town problems. The main character, so much as they had one, was named Peter, and he was a jock character. He was usually the focus of the show as well, but not always. His girlfriend Maggie was a cheerleader, and her best friend Sylvia was her constant companion. It was made pretty clear that Sylvia had a crush on Peter, and it's sometimes a point of contention between the two. Peter had 2 friends, Marcus and Bobby. Bobby is also kind of a jock, but he's more of a funny guy as well, who's always cracking jokes and trying to make people laugh. Marcus is a big guy who mostly seems to be into fixing up his truck. The other character's name is Kyle. He's kind of a typical bad boy. He's always fussing with his hair or working on his motorcycle, and sometimes he acts as a love interest for the 2 girl characters. The character models were pretty standard for the time, but I remember looking forward to watching the show again because it seemed so real to me. It was live action, so of course it was real people, but the situations and the problems always seemed like things I could relate to, despite the fact that I have no frame of reference for these kids and their schoolyard problems. My own high school was small, having about 500 people in it, and most of us had known each other long enough that we didn't really have any sort of drama surrounding people other than the usual girlfriend-boyfriend thing. As the tape started and the theme song played, I remembered how the first episode went, and it gave me a little of that nostalgia that my sister had been talking about. The first episode started with a moving shot of the creek, a place where most of the stories seemed to take place. It wasn't a huge creek, maybe 12 feet across and just deep enough to go in up to your waist, but it was their creek, and they used it quite often as a backdrop for stories and informational dumps. The show showed very little, usually opting to tell the viewers what they needed to know. The opening speech always left me a little misty-eyed, though I couldn't say why. Nobody knows why they call it Castor's Creek. Some people think Castor was the founder of the town, but there's never been any records to show one way or another if this is true. Some people think that Castor was a town hero, maybe a soldier who fought in a war, or who defended the town from one of the Indian tribes when they first settled here. There's no evidence of that either, but people still talk about it often. Others think it's just the guy who used to own the land, whose identity has been lost to time. Whatever the reason, the creek has a lot of meaning to me and my friends. The creek is like the lifeblood of this town, and it ebbs and flows, it rises and falls, and if we're lucky, it comes back the next year so that we can experience it all over again. Castor's Creek, Episode 1, Castor's Creek. The first episode starts with that monologue that I just read to you, and we see Peter sitting by a tree as he writes something in his notebook. I think, given what happens later in the episode, he might be working on a school paper, but it's never really made clear. Somebody calls his name, and Peter looks up as we're introduced to Bobby. Bobby comes up and tells him that Maggie is looking for him, and that she probably wants to invite him to the Sadie Hawkins dance. Peter sighs and says that he hasn't seen her, but he's sure that she'll find him eventually. We cut to the next day where Peter is reading his report, which is the part we heard at the start of the episode. He thanks the class, and his teacher tells him it's lovely before taking his paper and giving him an A. The bell rings then, and we see Peter leaving his English class. Maggie stops him in the hall and asks him if he wants to go to the Sadie Hawkins dance with her. Peter tells her he'll go, and she accuses him of not being very excited about it. He says it's just another dance, so what's there to get excited about? She starts to cry a little and tells him that he could at least act like he likes her. Peter says he does like her, that he probably even loves her, but that he's just not into dances, at least not as much as she is. She leaves, not mad, but not really happy with the answer, and Peter bumps into Selena as he heads to his next class. She asks if Maggie asked him to the dance, and he said she did. She mirrors Maggie's response by telling him that he doesn't sound very excited about it, and he reiterates his answer by saying he's just not that into dances. Selena asks if he would have gone if she had asked him, and Peter says he supposed he never really thought about it. Selena asks if he would go with her instead, and Peter says he doesn't want to cause drama. Selena leaves in much the same way that Maggie did, and Peter heads off to his next class. We cut to a little bit later as Bobby and Peter are walking home, talking about their day. Bobby says he asked Jenny if she would ask him to the dance, and she agreed, but Peter seems to be having a hard time getting excited about much of anything. The episode ends with Maggie calling to apologize for being a wet blanket, and telling him that she'll see him tomorrow. Peter heads off to bed, and the episode ends. For a first episode, it was pretty okay. There were 8 episodes of Castor's Creek, but I won't go into all of them. Most of them would bore you to tears. The show was sort of like Degrassi or any other number of teenage shows full of angst and drama at the time. It was the thing I noticed on the second watch-through that caught my attention. There were a couple of different times when you could see missing posters hanging up in the town where the show was shot, and they would be the posters of the kids that were on the show. Not only that, but there weren't a lot of background characters either. The show seemed to recycle extras, which is pretty regular, and you could see the same people in the background of most shots. It was like they hadn't bothered to use the people that lived in the town for the show, and it seemed a little weird. Castor's Creek, Episode 2 and 3, Thinking of Him and Loyalty. I'm going to mix these 2 episodes because they're kind of interchangeable. Both of them involve Maggie talking to Celine about the upcoming dance and her problems with Peter. There's a B-plot about football practice and math assignments, but most of it wraps around the 2 female characters as Maggie tries to figure out whether Peter really likes her or not. It flushes out a subplot where Selena is clearly interested in Peter, but she's torn between her loyalty to her friend and her desire to date someone she likes. At the end of the second episode, she decides to stay loyal to Maggie, but the tension builds as the story unfolds. Castor's Creek, Episode 4, The Big Game. This one sits around the big game between Massillon High School and their football rivals at Gwendolyn Prep. Peter, Bobby, and Mark are excited for the big game, and the cheerleaders are working hard on their routine. Peter is still kind of torn about whether or not to stay with his girlfriend, but he puts his effort into training and tries not to think about it. Selena starts dating Marcus, another member of the football team, who's friends with Peter, but doesn't really feel like he's being true to herself. The game goes well, and they win against their rivals, but the problem with the background characters seems to be even worse here. They cut back to the same 2 or 3 shots of the cheering crowd, and it's very obviously recycled. A lot of the kids on the opposing football team are also kids we've seen at the school or, just hanging around. I don't know why it caught my eye so much, but you would have thought if the show was going to be as popular as they clearly believed it would, they would have splurged on some new faces. The characters walk off smiling at the end of the game, and this is when we get our first look at Kyle. He's sitting on his bike in the parking lot, and when he winks at Maggie, it seems to be the first time we see her interact with any sort of attention to a character other than Peter. The episode ends with the 2 of them noticing each other, and then we transition into Episode 5. Caster's Creek, Episode 5, The Sadie Hawkins Dance. This was when the Sadie Hawkins dance comes into play. I think at one point they had meant for it to be a homecoming dance, but maybe they decided this would be better for some reason. All the kids get dressed up for the dance and arrive with their dates and head off in a limo for some reason, probably so all of them could be in the same spot. They're talking animatedly, all of them excited about the dance, except for Peter. Peter is still moody, and we see him casting glowers at Selena as she sits next to Marcus. She looks back at him as well, and the two of them are clearly sharing a moment. But it's cut short when Maggie notices and calls attention to her dress and how pretty it is. They get to the dance and are having fun for a while, Maggie and Peter dancing together. Bobby and Jenny dance together, and Celine and Marcus sit on the bleachers and talk. As they're dancing, Maggie catches sight of Kyle, who is watching her from the door of the gymnasium. He smiles at her, and he moves outside, and Peter says he's going to go talk to some of the other football guys as their dance comes to an end. Maggie says she's going to go get some air, and then she goes outside. She finally gets to speak with Kyle. Instead of talking with the football guys, though, we see Peter go over to Marcus and Celine and talk with them for a bit. Marcus goes to the bathroom, and Celine and Peter talk a little bit more about what she said the other day. They discuss their feelings somewhat and decide to have a dance. Meanwhile, Kyle and Maggie are talking to each other, and we get introduced to him properly for the first time. He tells Maggie that he's from the rival high school, Gwendolyn Prep, and he had hoped that she would be here because he wanted to find out more about her. This leads to them talking outside for a little bit before she invites him in to have a dance. When Peter sees this, despite the fact that he's dancing with her best friend, he gets mad and starts threatening Kyle. The two of them decide the dance isn't the best place to have a fight, an idea that's helped along by the chaperones, and they opt to do this later. The episode ends with Maggie holding Peter back and some of the other guys holding Kyle back. It's a little chaotic, but it's one of the last really normal episodes we get from the show. Caster's Creek, Episode 5, The Fight. The title of the episode seems to have nothing to do with what the episode is actually about. The fight was clearly supposed to be Kyle and Peter having their altercation, but it doesn't seem to be what we got. Instead, it's 25 minutes of grainy black and white shots of the main characters as they walk around the set and just seem to be between shots. We get Maggie and Celine talking about how the director has been running them ragged. Maggie says the shooting schedules are brutal, and she hopes it won't last much longer before they get what they need. Celine says she hasn't slept more than about 3 hours since they started shooting, and she's getting ragged. Both of them agree that the Sadie Hawkins dance, the episode before this one, was probably the worst of it, and they had more takes than any shoot they'd ever been to before. Whoever is running the camera clearly doesn't want to be seen, and it must be pretty small because when Selena turns, they duck into a doorway and the footage stops. We begin again with Bobby talking on an ancient cell phone. He's yelling at someone about this is a union violation and how they're supposed to be there for him, not these cocksucking Hollywood types. He says that they haven't had a day off in nearly a week, and the recording schedule's a real killer. He says he hasn't even gotten to talk to his parents in close to a month, and he thought they could do anything about this. And if he thought they could do anything about this, he would have called them instead of his manager. He's also glancing around like he thinks someone might be watching him, and whoever's on the phone with him is probably assuring him that this is just how the business is. He's doing a lot of nodding, a lot of humming, and then finally tells them to figure something out because he can't keep this up forever. Then he hangs up and walks away in a huff. Then we get another segment of Peter talking with a bald guy who must either be the scriptwriter or the director. He doesn't seem to be very happy with what he's reading, and the man looks to be trying to assure him that it's just how things are. Peter tells him that he's done shows like this before, and he knows how things are supposed to be, and this isn't it. He says they may be kids, but they still have rights, and he's not going to sit here and let this guy kill him for what may or may not be a hit show. The longer I watched all of this, the longer I believed that this wasn't meant for anybody to see. It clearly wasn't the episode they had in mind, and it was probably someone's attempt at blackmail. Whatever it is that Peter knows or doesn't know, the man he's talking to finally has enough of being talked to in that way. He begins yelling at Peter and telling him that he doesn't call the shots around here, and that he's just better be glad that he has a job at all. He says that he's the director, and if he says that's how it goes, then that's how it goes. And if Peter wants to continue to work in this industry, then he needs to figure that out. Peter looks kind of scared, and as he finally puts his hands up and walks away, the man nods and goes back to whatever he was doing. There's a grainy shot, last in line, but there's no sound. It's definitely all the kids standing together and talking quietly. Whatever they're talking about, they're clearly not wanting anyone to know about it. The scene cuts out halfway through as we see Kyle standing over Peter and asking if he's had enough. The episode seems to start back up as it was supposed to, and ends as Peter tells him that this isn't over. They're back in their normal attire, and it's pretty clear that this was supposed to be during the Sadie Hawkins dance. Peter tells Maggie to come on, and she leaves with him, but she looks back at Kyle as he lights a cigarette and leans against his motorcycle. That's how the episode ends, but it was an episode that gave us a little more to think about than they intended. Castor's Creek, Episode 6 and 7, The Aftermath, and The Kindling. I'm going to put these two together as well because the particulars of the episode are less important than what you could see during the episode. They all revolve around what Kyle was thinking about after the fight and what Peter was going to do after the battle. There was a lot of brooding and a lot of strained back and forth between the female leads and the two male leads, but after the last video, I found myself watching the actors a little more closely. I had worked some long hours before, and I knew what exhaustion looked like. These kids looked like they were on their last legs, and a lot of them were delivering lines with less than their usual enthusiasm. Peter was supposed to be melancholy, but he came off as more bored than anything. Kyle didn't seem as tired as the rest of them, but he hadn't really been there for quite as long either, so that made sense. All the actors had deep bags under their eyes, and they all looked like they were just trying to get through the day so that they could lay down for a little while. Peter looked to be sporting a black eye, which made sense after the fight, but it looked a little better than stage makeup. It made me think that someone might actually be racking this kid over, and I had to rewind to be sure, but I was almost certain that it had appeared in the middle of the episode. Whatever the case, Peter finally decided to tell Celine how he felt, and the two of them began talking about what they were going to do about Maggie and Marcus. Maggie also met with Kyle, and they tried to figure out what they were going to do about their burgeoning romance. They end up sharing a kiss and finish out the episode talking about what they were going to do about Peter. That brought us into episode 8, the finale, whether it was supposed to be or not. I've watched these episodes hundreds of times, but when I was younger, I always skipped over episode 8 and episode 5. They didn't really make a lot of sense, and they didn't seem to go along with the story at all. Now that I was older, it made a lot more sense why they didn't, and I watched episode 8 with new eyes. Castor's Creek, episode 8, The Creek Bed. The episode begins with Peter and Maggie sitting by the creek. Peter has clearly asked her to come and meet him here, though it doesn't appear that she understands why. They're talking about their relationship, about what they should do, and it's pretty clear that the actors are tired. Peter keeps rubbing his eyes, wanting to go home so he can sleep, and his lines are barely understandable as he mumbles them. He's breaking up with her, that much is obvious, but he doesn't seem to know how to go about it, and finally, He tells the director that he needs a break. He just breaks character right in the middle of the scene and tells the director that he needs a minute to collect himself. Maggie looks fearful, but you can hear the director yelling at them off screen. He tells them to keep rolling. He tells them that they can take a break when he says they can take a break. Peter says he's had enough. He says that everyone's had enough, and they all just want to rest. The director says he doesn't care what everybody wants, and that they're going to keep doing it for as long as he says they're going to keep doing it. The camera suddenly falls to the side, and the same balding man from before steps forward and starts shoving Peter as he yells at him. He's calling him a brat. He's calling him a hack, and he's telling him he'll never work in showbiz again with this attitude. And when Peter falls into the creek, he towers over him and tells him he better keep going or he's going to drown him right here in that creek. The last shot is just Peter staring up at the man as Maggie cries, and everyone else mumbles quietly behind them. The scene ends without credits, and the tape just sort of cuts out. The two of us just sit there watching the screen, not really sure what to do. "I guess," I said, as I listened to the tape rewind, "there's only one more tape for us to watch, if we can find it." My sister nods, and luckily for you, as we were watching this one, I remembered where I put it. She went into the loft where we had both slept, and went into the side where her room had once been. There was a wall between the rooms, something my father had added when I got old enough to start middle school, and I hadn't actually been in her room in 20 years. Mom hadn't changed the things in here after she moved out either. It was still all band posters and a battered vanity with makeup stains and powder residue. My sister's bed sat across from the door, and as she pushed it aside, I saw that I hadn't been the only one with a hiding place. My sister pulled open the hatch, and I saw her take out some pictures, as well as a makeup palette and a tape. "I hid it here after you left. It was a comfort to me when it was just Mom and I." I looked at the title on the videotape and was unsurprised to see that it was Ashley Swing. Ashley Swing was a show about a woman in her early 30s named Ashley. She would come out to a large swing that overlooked a cliff and swung back and forth as she talked to the audience about different problems or concerns of the day. I never really watched it. It was something that my sister had loved, but I had felt that I was a little too old for it. Ashley Swing was in the same vein as shows like Mr. Rogers, and I was too old for that kind of kid stuff. I remembered that my sister had watched all the episodes several times, and it wasn't a huge surprise that she still had it. The show didn't even have a real intro. It was just a title card, and then a big shot of the swing as Ashley came into frame. She was on her swing, going back and forth, and that cliff face bloomed ahead of her like a dangerous animal. Her show was less of a show and more like something you'd see in an ad break. There were these little 5 to 8 minute slots that were probably played during other shows, and they were more musings and advice than anything else. She didn't even seem to notice that the camera was on her at first, looking at the distance as she went back and forth. When she finally looked back, she smiled and began what constituted as her show. We went downstairs and popped it in, my sister beaming as the familiar opening played, and we saw Ashley on her swing once again. Ashley Swing, Episode 1. She smiled at the viewers, looking back at the chasm before saying, "Sometimes I think this cliff is a lot like some of my viewers at home. It's wide and vast and sometimes hard to understand. It's important that we remember that not everybody can be understood. Some people simply are, and we just have to accept them the way they are. I know you boys and girls will know what I'm talking about." There was a song break then about a bluebird and how it stayed happy, sung by Miss Ashley herself. It went on for a few minutes, but when it ended, she came back into frame and watched the cliff a little more, as she swung back and forth. We have to be thankful for each and every day. Who knows when we might find that our days are not promised and our time has come at last. Remember that as you go about your day. Remember that and be grateful as you do. Until next time, I'll be here when you need me. There was no end credits, and there was no more of a song than there had been an intro. She just went right on swinging for a few more minutes, and then the episode was over. Ashley's Swing, Episode 2. The next episode began much the way the first one had, but today, Miss Ashley was swinging in the rain. The rain pattered down on her as she placidly went back and forth. And then she noticed the children there, and smiled as if she had only been waiting for them to arrive. There's no sense letting a little rain spoil your day. Rain is just about the most natural thing there is. It feeds the crops, it feeds us, and it nourishes the heart and the soul. We should always remember that before we think less of the rain. Without the rain, how would we appreciate the rainbow? Then she sang Rain, Rain, Go Away, which seemed a little bit against her message and detracted slightly from the appreciation for the rain. But it was hard to be too upset about it because Miss Ashley sang everything very prettily. After that, she went back to swinging, just looking out at the cliff, and I wondered why her swing was so close to that cliff face. Seemed like a dangerous place to put it, but when she finally looked back at the camera, she looked like she might have been crying. It was hard to tell. It was raining, after all. Her smile was just as radiant, but her eyes looked wet and a little red. Always remember, children, some rain must fall in every life. No one is immune to suffering. No one is immune to strife. We're all vessels for pain sometimes. But like a sudden rainstorm, a rainbow will come once such hardships are over. So don't give up hope on your rainbow. It could be just around the corner. Goodbye, children. I'll see you tomorrow. I paused the show and looked at my sister. I'd only seen the first episode of this, having been a little too old for this sort of show when we had gotten it. I don't know why, but I didn't much like the look of it. The way Miss Ashley kept looking out over that cliff made me more than a little worried about what might be in store down the line. Whoever was sending us these tapes, they never seemed to send us anything nice. It made me wonder again who this mysterious tape sender was, and why they had decided to send us such terrible things by mail. What is this show? My sister said nothing. Why do you want to watch it so badly after all these years? My sister said nothing. Answer me. If you want to know, then finish watching the show. It has all the answers you'll ever need. There wasn't much else to do after that, so I decided to watch the show. So many of these shows were like touchstones to a world that we had left behind. It was like a song you heard when you were a kid, and then never heard again. It was a smell, a sound, something you remembered for the rest of your life, but only in a fuzzy way that wouldn't make sense to anyone else who hadn't seen it. I suppose that's what my sister was after. But the longer we watched, the less sure of that I became. The longer we watched, the less I believed she knew what she was looking for. Ashley's Swing, Episode 3. It was a pleasant sunny day, and Miss Ashley was once again on her swing. She was going back and forth, and the sound of the ropes creaking was soothing somehow. It was like listening to a ship's sail as it caught the breeze in a high wind. It was like listening to the bindings on a rope swing. It was like listening to a body as it swung on a gibbet. Spring days always make me think of him. Where is he now? What is he doing? Where do people go when you can't see them anymore? It seems that something like that creates more questions than answers. Wouldn't you agree? I hope wherever he is, he's happy. I hope wherever he is, he doesn't miss me too badly. Then she sang a song about missing someone and the longing feeling that such a missing would bring about. She sang about finding them again further down the path, and when the song ended, we once again came back to find her crying. She wasn't smiling this time, though. She just swung back and forth and cried ceaselessly about whoever this person was that she was talking about. For some reason, I thought it might be a child, but it was just a guess. Her face had looked the way my mother's had sometimes, when my sister was away at someone's house, and she was worried about her. For nearly 6 minutes, we watched as Miss Ashley cried and cried, and then the episode abruptly ended. Ashley's Swing, Episode 4. It was winter now, and the snow was thick on the ground. If it bothered Miss Ashley, she never showed it. It appeared that she would swing in any weather, and she was dressed in a snowsuit and thick black boots. She went back and forth, humming to herself before finally noticing the camera. She smiled and turned back to the cliff, and it was almost like the cliff was another character on the show. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but it's true. The cliff was her co-star, and she depended on its presence almost as much as it depended on her. On days like this, I like to bring a pot of hot tea with me and think about the people that mean so much to me. Some of them are gone. Some of them choose to stay away. But so many of them are still people that I think very highly of. People are like that sometimes. They go away because you're not the same person they knew. They go away because they find that the person you've become is not the person that they like. It's always hard when that happens, but we can't take it to heart. If we spend all our time wondering who we should be for this person to like us, then we never find the person that we could truly be. Remember that the next time you discover someone who you truly love. It's okay to love people, but don't hold them so close that your arms are empty when they're gone. Then she looked back out at the cliff, watching the snow come down, and she sang the most beautiful version of Silent Night I had ever heard in my entire life. It was chilling, and I wondered if she intended for it to sound so ethereal. She must have. There was no way she could have done it unintentionally. When her song ended, she went right on swinging as the snow came down, until she looked back at the camera and seemed to be ready with another bit of wisdom. During the holiday season, it's important to know what gifts you've been given by those around you. Just because it doesn't come in a box doesn't mean it isn't special. Sometimes the greatest gift of all is a gift we don't even realize. A gift that the gift giver doesn't even realize. Always remember to count your blessings, and always remember to be grateful for what you have while you have it. I wish sometimes I had been a little more grateful. She went back to swinging, and the episode abruptly ended, as it so often did. Something about watching that snow as it fell around her was incredibly sad. The whole show was incredibly sad, and it was a little like witnessing someone's slow and deliberate suicide note. I wasn't sure that I wanted to see the end of this, and every time she looked at that cliff, I became more and more sure of how this was all going to end. Ashley Swing, Episode 5. It was a summer day, and the valley below the cliff was a riot of wildflowers. You could see them everywhere, and they were lovely. I didn't think I had ever seen that many wildflowers in one place before. Miss Ashley must have been happy to see the flowers, too, because she kept right on swinging and looking at them, as the children at home were likely waiting to be noticed. She didn't notice them this time, though. She just kept right on swinging and looking at the flowers. It went on like that for quite some time, and I began to worry that this was going to be some kind of strange, unaired episode that only we were going to be privy to. The episode went on for almost 8 minutes, but it was the last 2 minutes that really mattered. 6 minutes in, Miss Ashley began to mumble, but it wasn't until there was a minute left in the episode that you could actually hear her. Looking at these flowers is like losing him all over again. I don't know why I come here. I don't know why I care. There's 30 seconds of silence after that, and then the episode abruptly ends. Ashley Swing, Episode 6. It's autumn, and there's a jack-o'-lantern sitting in her lap as she swings today. There's a name drawn on the front of the pumpkin, and I had to squint at it before I realized the name was David. It was a little weird, but I suppose maybe she had made the pumpkin for someone. She swung for a little while, but when she turned to look at us, she smiled and set the pumpkin down before beginning her work. Fall is a time of growing. It's a time when we harvest things, and we get our last harvest in before the winter comes and takes it from us. Sometimes people are the harvest for winter. I know that may sound silly, but people and vegetables aren't so very different if you think about it. A pumpkin can smile, and a pumpkin can die. A pumpkin can grow, and a baby can grow. When we lose a pumpkin, sometimes it's very sad. And when we lose a child, it's always very sad. Be sure, though, that you will reap what you sow. We all must take our harvest, whether it is sustenance or only bitter tears. Then she sang a version of Five Little Ducks that involved pumpkins, and once again I was pretty sure that she was crying, as she likely took a personal stake in the part of the mother pumpkin. When the song ended, she wiped her eyes and turned silently back to the camera, as if she had almost forgotten we were there. I know for some, fall is all about candy and ghosts, but sometimes the ghosts inside your heart are the scariest of them all. The candy you get from them is nothing but regret and sour memories, so be careful how much of it you eat. The sour stomach you get may be something you keep for the rest of your life. She turned back to the cliff and watched it as she swung again. That's how the episode ended. Ashley Swing, Episode 7. This is the last one, my sister whispered. It's one of my favorites. I wasn't sure if that made me more or less eager to see it, but either way I watched. Episode 7 began as they all began. Miss Ashley on her swing as she went back and forth, just as she had done 1,000 times before. She was looking at the cliff again, her eyes eternally locked on that damn cliff. But she didn't look up this time. She was sitting by the cliffside in the early evening, and I began to wonder what the point of all this was. Why was she so close to the cliff's edge? Why was she recording here in the first place? It all seemed to make less and less sense the more I thought about it. Most of the episodes we watched had been about 8 minutes long, but this one lasted at least half an hour. She sat there and watched the sun go down as the swing creaked and ground as she went back and forth. It was getting dark on screen, her back still to us, as the ropes of the swing creaked and creaked. Then she stopped. She stopped and got up from the swing and walked towards the edge of the cliff. This was at the 11-minute mark. She stood on the side of the cliff for 2 or 3 minutes, just looking down into the mouth of that gaping chasm. At 14.5 minutes, she says something that I had no trouble making out, and it put the entire show into perspective. "I'm coming, David." She says it so low, she's almost whispering it. But the way she said it, with such agony and hurt, she might as well have been shouting it. Then she tilts forward and goes right over the edge and down into nothing. The camera keeps recording for about 30 seconds, and then the video abruptly stops. I turned back and looked at my sister as the snow began to fall on the screen. She was wearing a look of such profound peace that it was difficult to be upset with her for exposing me to this. Times had been pretty hard for her lately, and if this brought her some sort of joy, then I suppose it had been worth it. The longer we watched the screen, however, the more her smile began to slip. "I guess that's it." My sister said nothing, just continued to watch the screen. "That's the last episode, so I guess you got what you were after. You can take them and sell them now." She continued to say nothing. "I guess it's a shame that we tossed out the laughing place. You could have probably gotten a mint for that." "We didn't," she said, and her voice made me jump a little. "What do you mean? We threw it out into the snow the first time we watched it." "No, it's here. It's always been here." I stared at her for a few minutes, not quite sure I understood what she was saying. "What do you mean? We threw it into the snow. It sank into that white powder in the backyard, and we knew that it would get wet and the earth would reclaim it, and..." My sister looked guilty for a moment before standing up and reaching into her purse. I was a little bit afraid of what she might pull out. It was impossible. There was no way. She still had that tape. We'd both been so utterly traumatized by what we had seen that I doubted either of us would go looking for something like that again. It appeared, however, that I've been wrong. She'd gone looking for it. She'd found something that still horrifies me to this day. Laughing Place was the last of the mail-order VHSs that I ever watched. I was 13 when it came. My sister was 11, and I'd started making friends outside the house. I was getting ready to go into middle school, and sitting around and watching kid shows on the VCR didn't really appeal to me anymore. I still watched Castor's Creek sometimes, but the rest of it seemed childish. It was the last VHS tape I remember getting in the mail, and it had been waiting for us when we got home from school. Mom had left it sitting on the kitchen table, and it sat there with a note. "I'll be back later. There's a casserole in the fridge. You two can watch a movie and eat dinner, but be in bed by 9. Love, Mom." My sister said that she'd set the oven if I would set the table. I put out the plates and the cups. She heated up the dinner, and when it was ready, we sat down to watch whatever this new VHS tape was. The The card in the front said it was called Laughing Place, and both of us agreed it was a pretty weird name for a show. By this point, we were almost used to the strange quality of these tapes, but nothing could have prepared us for what we were about to see. It wasn't a TV show. Not really. It was more like a movie, and we only made it to about 30 minutes in before I begged her to turn it off. Sometimes at night, I still wake up hearing the laughter on that day, and it's one of the few childhood fears that I've retained. I think it was supposed to be a TV show. The premise was this group of kids would go into the woods when they were having a bad day or having an argument and find a cave that was called the Laughing Place. The cave was supposed to make them feel better, change their day for the better, but what we got was almost Blair Witch-like in its quality and composition. I watched The Blair Witch once, and while the friends that I saw it with thought it was campy and a little over the top, I remember shaking in my boots as I watched those three go into the woods. Whether they knew it or not, those three were going to their own laughing place. The tape came out of her purse, and it was the same as it had been when we took it out of the mailing envelope. How can this be? How can you have this tape? My sister said nothing, but the tape was very clearly the one we had watched that night as we sat around the coffee table and drank Kool-Aid and Tera in equal parts. It started out with four kids who were playing in a park. They were playing Foursquare, but they seemed to have gotten into a squabble over whose turn it was to make the first move. The squabble turned into a shouting match, and when one of them threw the ball down a little harder than they should have, it went into the woods, and the four kids went after it. They were still arguing about whose fault it was, and who was going to go get it, and who was going to go first when they got back. But all of a sudden, the footage got grainy, and we got a cam shot of an adult walking into the woods as he spoke on what must have been an ancient cell phone. There were four kids hiking with a group of adults. The woods looked like the same woods the kids had run into, and it seemed like whoever was operating the camera was not having a good time. We're going to the site. No, it's for this new kids show. Janie says that she and Mark found this cave in the woods that we just have to use for the show. Yeah, no, she says it really laughs, and it's just what we need for the show. She says it'll save us a bundle on set design and having to hire someone to do the voice for the cave. Yeah, I think she and Mark were probably a little too done up on mescaline and thought they found a laughing cave. No, they actually have video footage of the cave laughing, but it's probably just the wind going over a hole or something. Yeah, management is pretty adamant that they want us to go out there. I guess they were really impressed with the video. No, we'll be back Monday. Yeah, He's been walking and talking the whole time, and his feet are crunching on the leaves and sticks as he goes. He's cut off suddenly when he trips into a hole, and the last thing we hear before it returns to the show is him cursing loudly and the camera going off. The show came back, and the kids find their ball at the mouth of this weird cave in the middle of the woods. The cave is cool. The mouth is easily 15 feet high, and it goes into the ground like the gaping maw of some hungry monster. As one of them picks up the ball, the cave laughs uproariously, and the kids look at it in fear. I don't know if that was their stage direction, but all of them look at the cave like it might try to hurt them or something. What's the matter, kids? Have you never seen a laughing place before? The kids look at each other, clearly thinking they're losing their minds, and then the cave laughs again, and all the kids start laughing too. One of the kids, a sandy-haired boy of about 8, asks the cave what a laughing place is, and the cave laughs like it's the most hilarious thing it's ever heard. What's a laughing place? Why, that's where you go when you're feeling down, and you need to remember the good times. It sounds like you kids need to remember some good times, too. Come on, kids, let's laugh and remember the blessings that we hold so dear. The cave starts laughing its non-existent head off, and the laughter must be infectious because all the kids start laughing and rolling on the ground as well. Their ball is forgotten, but they don't seem to mind. There's tears running out of their eyes, and all of them look like they might be about to have a stroke right there in the dirt. I remember thinking when I was a kid that they all looked like they were choking, and as the camera pans in on one of the kids, he really does seem like he's having trouble catching his breath. There's some talking offset, and some of the adults come into the scene as they seem to be trying to get the kids to stop laughing. The cave just laughs on and on like it's having the time of its life, and when the camera finally cuts, we can still see the kids rolling on the ground laughing. It cuts back on after a minute, and it's the same cameraman from earlier. He's back to talking on his cell phone, and I have to believe that none of this is planned. The phone calls are always so candid, and it seems like maybe he's keeping a tight grip on his camera in between shoots. Look, Mark, I don't give a shit what kind of thing you think this is. I need to know what the hell is going on here. No, it's not just some kind of sound coming out of the cave. There's a voice in that cave, and I need to know who it is. Why? Oh, no particular reason. Just Ashton Spade won't stop laughing, and we're having a really hard time getting him to take a breath to keep living. Is that a good enough reason for you, Mark? No, we can't get an ambulance out here, and we're 5 goddamn miles into the woods. We're gonna have to carry him out, and he's rolling around and convulsing like he's having a goddamn stroke. I don't know what the hell is going on here, Mark, but you... He stops then, as somebody calls out to him. His name is Grady, apparently, and he looks off camera as somebody tells him that the kid in question is nowhere to be found. What do you mean he's nowhere to be found? He was rolling on the ground and having a fit. Are you telling me you can't find a laughing kid? The audio is a little garbled, but I'm guessing that they told Grady that the kid had vanished or something. I've got to go handle this, but if this is some kind of sick joke or a setup, then you better be ready to take the brunt of the lawsuit. You know how the Spaders are about their son. They're the most sue-happy bunch of assholes I've ever met. All right, I'll be in touch. Bye. He hung up the call, but he didn't turn off the camera. What Mr. Grady did was move off into the woods as he began looking for the boy. He was calling for Ashton as he searched through the dark woods, but it was what you could hear in the background as he called that put my hair up. You can hear the sound of that laughing cave as it laughs and laughs and laughs. It had been highly upsetting in the daytime, but at night it was like sleeping in a haunted house and hearing someone call your name. It went on like that for 5 minutes, but it felt like much longer. Finally, Grady seems to remember that he had turned the camera on, or noticed that he had turned it on at all. He flipped it off, but when he came back, there was more laughter. The camera was pointed at 3 kids in sleeping bags, and all of them were chuckling quietly. They'd been tied into the sleeping bags with belts or duct tape, or a combination of the two, and they were wriggling around like they were having a fit as they stared at the roof of the tent. I'm recording this for my own safety. These 3 kids are safe, but we have yet to find Ashton Spader. I've also lost one of the camera guys that came out here with me. Brock went to look for Ashton in that fucking cave, and he hasn't come back. I think I know where Ashton is, but I don't know if I'm brave enough to go looking for him. In the morning, we're going home. If I have to drag all of these kids out here on my shoulders, I will. But I'm leaving these woods tomorrow. It was hard to hear him sometimes, because I could still hear the laughing place as it laughed on and on and on. It wasn't saying anything. It was just chuckling endlessly, like some sort of deranged cartoon character. I was never sure why they were so close to the cave, but maybe they weren't. Maybe the cave was simply too loud to be ignored. Whatever it was, the tape went off after his declaration, and then picked back up after a few seconds of static. He was standing outside the cave, and the laughing was almost deafening. I'm the only one left. I passed out for half an hour and woke up to find the kids had escaped. George is gone too. I have a pretty good idea where they've all gone. He's walking towards the cave now, and this is when I begin to hear the laughter is different somehow. It's not just the cave laughing anymore. It's the laughter of other people. It's children's laughter. It's male laughter. And it's that ceaseless cartoon laughter that comes from the depths of the laughing place. Do you think this is funny? Do you think you can just take my kids and my crew and just laugh about it? Give them back. You're gonna ruin everything. God damn it, you won't get me. I don't find any of this funny, and I'm not gonna play your games. He walks towards the cave, his steps slow and deliberate. And that was the point where I'd had enough. I hadn't said anything to my sister that night. I'd simply stood up and ejected the tape before taking it onto the back porch and throwing it out into the snow. The stone wasn't deep, not yet, but it would be deep enough to keep Mom and Dad away for the rest of the night. That night we had a blizzard, the first one of the season, and Mom had to stay with a friend while Dad slept in the bunkhouse at the factory he worked at. When I came back inside, my sister was crying. Her eyes were full of tears, and I held her and told her it was going to be okay. I had always assumed that she was crying because she was terrified, like I was. But as she stood there with the tape in her hand, I thought maybe she'd been crying for a different reason. Maybe she'd been crying because she wanted to know how it all ended. Maybe she'd been crying because of the laughing place. I had held her for the rest of the night, letting her sleep in my bed with me as the blizzard raged outside. I'd woken up to find her gone, but when I looked for her, she was in her own bed. I tried not to think about the tape anymore after that, and I asked Mom not to bring us any more of the VHSs once she got home later. She asked if we had gotten a scary one, and I told her that it had upset us pretty bad, and I'd thrown it away. I don't know if any other tapes ever came in. Mom never brought them inside. Whether Laughing Place was the last, or she just started throwing them away after that, I have no idea. What I do know is that Laughing Place has haunted me ever since. And now, my sister was standing in our living room, holding it like some kind of totem. Come watch it with me. We can finish it together. We should have finished it that night. Should have seen what happened to the children and the directors. You weren't crying because it scared you, I said as I suddenly realized what her tears had been about. You were crying because you wanted to see the rest of it. Yes. All my nightmares, all my tears. It was because I was afraid that I would never get to see the end of that show. That's what all these shows have been. They've all been glimpses into something truly terrible, something that all children must see. Childhood is always remembered as something wonderful and bright, but there's fear and terror there as well. The terror prepares you for what's to come later on, and when you told Mom that you didn't want the tapes anymore, it was all I could do not to scream. But how did you get it? It snowed so much that night. There was no way you could have found it. I didn't have to. It appeared in my secret place. I was looking for something one day, years after you had gone to college and I was still at home, and I found it down there, along with Ashley's swing. I didn't put them there, and no one else knew about the place. In a way, that hiding place was my laughing place. In a way, it was my personal place that no one else could find. Now, don't you want to know how it ends? Don't you want to know what happens? I was already backing for the door, the tape held up to the VCR like a threat. I didn't say anything. I just left our childhood home, got in my car, and drove away. I had dreamed about that tape for years, and I didn't want to know what sort of horrors lay at the end of it. That was 8 months ago. I returned home, went back to my life, but I never quite forgot about those tapes. I started dreaming about the laughing place again. I started dreaming about all of them. I dreamed about Castor's Creek and Roto Robots and Bobo's Circus and Holly's Hobbies and even Ashley's Swing, which I'd only seen a few times. They haunted me like ghosts. And eventually, I went looking for answers. The programs were pretty niche, but I found a couple of things that might sate the curiosity of those who followed the story from the beginning. Bobo's Circus. Bobo's Circus has no current information about any of the actors or the sets involved. The only thing I could find is an interview with the guy who allegedly played the strongman. He said the director was a big shot who'd been in television since the early 60s. He started out really liking the character of Bobo, but eventually came to hate him and took it out on him on set. He claimed that the beating scene was real, and also claimed that there were more episodes that got gradually more violent. He couldn't talk about the other episodes, not because of an NDA or anything, but because he was afraid of the director. The man had been dead for 40 years, but his name still held a lot of weight. The girl who played Clarabelle talked to someone once. She was going to tell a newspaper guy about what was happening, even though we warned her not to. The next day, they found her dead in an alley. I'm not sure if something's going to happen to me because I told somebody, but people deserve to know. He died a couple of days after that interview. He was run over by a car outside his house, and his body was left in the road for nearly an hour. Roto Robots. The studio that did Roto Robots was a small one out of eastern Canada. They'd planned to do 30 episodes, and the first 3 episodes and the last 3 episodes were actually at different ends of the release schedule. Episode 1, 2, and 3 were in order. Episode 4 was supposed to be episode 25, and the last 2 episodes were episode 29 and 30. There were 3 creators, and the 2 that were left admitted that the show got gradually darker as it went on. They blamed the 3rd director for this, saying they didn't agree with his direction, but he'd put a lot of money into the production, and he called most of the shots. We aren't sure what happened, but when the studio burned down one evening, it burned down with most of the unaired episodes and Steve inside. I'm sure a few episodes still exist. We sent out some test reels and things to certain organizations, but to my knowledge, 90% of the episodes burned up with their creator. Holly's Hobbies. Holly was a recovering drug addict who was using the show to kick her habit. She'd taken to crafting during rehab and had fallen in with a sketchy producer when she got out. The show was like therapy to her, but her producer was not the sort of man that you wanted to put your life in the hands of. He had a reputation in the industry for being into all sorts of questionable things, and it was widely believed he had gotten Holly back on drugs and was using the show to control her. One of the cameramen claimed that Holly tried to kill herself on set during the last episode, but she was stopped and institutionalized. Castor's Creek. Castor's Creek was actually supposed to be the next Degrassi before the director went a little nuts. The weird part is the director of Castor's Creek was also the director of Bobo's Circus. He was younger when he was working on Bobo's Circus, but after looking at a picture of him, it was definitely him. He'd wanted to have one more hit before he retired, and because of it, he'd pushed his actors too hard. They'd decided to stand up to him, and he'd flown into a rage and nearly drowned his male lead in the creek. They stopped him, but it was kind of what kept him out of showbiz after that. He'd been forced to retire, and the industry had apparently breathed a sigh of relief. I did some digging, these tapes becoming kind of my obsession, and discovered he was also the sketchy director for Holly's Hobbies. That made me dig a little deeper, and I found out that he was the major backer in the studio that produced Roto Robots. The studio was hemorrhaging money, though, and it was widely believed that whoever set the fire had done so to recoup some of their losses. I suspected that he might be connected with Ashley Swing as well, but it turned out I was wrong. Ashley Swing. Ashley Mills was a grieving mother who had recently lost her son, David. The show was supposed to help her cope with the loss, but it only served to help her wallow in it. Ashley Swing was a public access show with illusions of being placed on PBS. When Ashley's depression became too much, she took her own life, and the show was cut short. Finally, Laughing Place. Laughing Place was the last attempt at relevancy for a director who was attempting to break back into the business. Grady Glenn, the man connected to so much tragedy, is already someone we've talked about. He had attempted to create a children's show after a few of his friends had found a mysterious cave in the forest that supposedly laughed. They'd had an idea for a show for kids, and this seemed to Grady like it would be a hit. So he'd taken a bunch of kids and some film crews out in the woods and decided to test just what the cave could do. It all went wrong, though, and he lost the kids and his crew and was never heard from again. Searching the woods netted them nothing. No one was ever found. They never found the cave either, but somebody must have found his footage. Turns out, Laughing Place was also our connection to Ashley Swing. Ashley's son David was one of the kids that had went missing, and it was finally what drove her over the edge, no pun intended. I know this seems like it was all just there for me to find, but what you're reading actually represents about 8 months of digging and vetting information from forums and articles. Like any bit of lost media, there are a lot of wild rumors and ghost stories that surrounded it, but what it boils down to is a man who mistreated his actors, potentially some of the people who were working for him, and then lost his life along with a bunch of kids out in the woods. He was a sick, depraved individual, and the world is probably better for his passing. It's been 8 months since my mom died, and my sister and I sat in our old house and watched movies. I haven't heard from her since that night. I called, but she never answers. Her ex-husband called me last week and asked if I'd heard from her. She hasn't been back to town, and she hasn't come to see the kids. I told him I haven't seen her since Mom's funeral, but I wonder if I'd find her sprawled on the floor of our old home. I don't think I'll ever figure out who sent those tapes, but I do know one thing. I don't think she really ever wanted to sell them. I think somehow the siren song of those videotapes called to her, and she answered. Those tapes brought her back to a time when she felt safe, and I'm a little afraid of what I'd find if I went up to my childhood home. I might be the last living member of my family, and I'd hate to see the snow reflected in her still open eyes as she lays across the carpet, doing what she truly loved, one final time.
And just like that, our stories are over for another day. But don't worry, we'll be back again very soon with more cozy horror. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.